What we're witnessing unfold in Tehran represents something far more significant than the headlines suggest. Reports emerging over the past several hours indicate that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has relocated from Tehran under circumstances that remain deliberately unclear. Now, this coincides, and I don't believe this is coincidental, with what appears to be an extraordinary demand from the Trump administration to the United Kingdom: join a coordinated military operation targeting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps inside Iran itself. The implications here are staggering. We're not talking about sanctions or diplomatic pressure. We're talking about direct military action against a sovereign nation's most powerful military institution. The IRGC isn't simply another branch of Iran's armed forces. It's the ideological backbone of the Islamic Republic, deeply embedded in the country's economy, politics, and regional influence operations across the Middle East. What makes this particularly remarkable is the timing. Trump has barely settled into his second term, yet we're already seeing a fundamental recalibration of Western posture toward Iran. The question we must ask ourselves is, what has changed so dramatically that such drastic measures are now being openly contemplated? To understand what's happening right now, we need to step back and look at the broader strategic picture that's been developing over the past several months. Really, since the moment it became clear that Donald Trump would be returning to the White House, the relationship between the United States and Iran has always been one of the most complex and contentious in modern geopolitics. But what we're seeing now goes beyond the usual cycle of tensions and temporary de-escalations that have characterized this relationship for decades. This feels different. This feels like we're approaching a genuine inflection point. Let's start with what we actually know about Khamenei's movements. According to multiple sources, and I should stress that information coming out of Iran is always somewhat murky, always filtered through various political lenses, the supreme leader has apparently moved from his usual residence in Tehran to a location that has not been officially disclosed. Now, Iranian officials, when pressed on this, have offered various explanations. Some have suggested it's routine security protocols. Others have mentioned planned meetings with regional representatives in a different city. But the opacity surrounding this move, the lack of clear communication, the conflicting statements from different officials, all of this suggests that whatever is happening is neither routine nor planned well in advance. The timing is what's most striking to me. We're seeing this relocation occur precisely as reports emerge of Trump administration officials holding what are described as intensive consultations with their British counterparts. And the subject of these consultations, according to well-placed sources in both Washington and London, is nothing less than a coordinated military response to what the Trump administration characterizes as escalating IRGC activities throughout the Middle East. Now, when we talk about the IRGC, we're talking about an organization that is absolutely central to Iran's projection of power beyond its borders. This isn't simply a military force in the conventional sense. The Revolutionary Guard operates as a state within a state, controlling vast sectors of Iran's economy, managing relationships with proxy forces from Lebanon to Yemen, and serving as the primary instrument through which Tehran exerts influence across the region. What Trump appears to be proposing, and again, we're piecing this together from multiple sources because there's been no official public statement laying out the full scope of what's being discussed, is something that would have been almost unthinkable even a few months ago. We're talking about direct military strikes against IRGC facilities, leadership targets, and possibly even infrastructure within Iran itself. This isn't about hitting proxy forces in Syria or Iraq. This isn't about intercepting weapons shipments or conducting cyber operations. This is about strikes inside Iranian territory, targeting an organization that is, for all practical purposes, inseparable from the Iranian state itself. The British dimension of this is particularly fascinating and, I must say, somewhat perplexing. The United Kingdom has historically been more cautious than the United States when it comes to military confrontation with Iran. Even during the Trump administration's first term, when Washington withdrew from the nuclear deal and imposed maximum pressure sanctions, London maintained a more diplomatic approach, working with European partners to try to preserve some framework for engagement with Tehran. So for Trump to be demanding, and that does appear to be the word, demanding British participation in what would essentially be an act of war against Iran represents a significant shift in how Washington is approaching its relationships with traditional allies. We have to consider what this tells us about Trump's broader strategic vision for his second term. During the campaign, he spoke repeatedly about ending wars, about bringing American troops home, about focusing on domestic priorities rather than foreign entanglements. Yet here we are, barely into his presidency, and we're discussing the possibility of opening a new military front against a country of 85 million people with significant military capabilities and deep strategic relationships with both Russia and China. How do we reconcile these apparently contradictory impulses? I think the answer lies in how Trump and his advisors view deterrence and strength. They appear to believe that the previous administration's approach, attempting to revive the nuclear deal, offering sanctions relief in exchange for behavioral changes, was perceived by Tehran as weakness, as an invitation to expand IRGC activities throughout the region with minimal consequences. From Trump's perspective, the IRGC's continued support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for various militia groups in Iraq and Syria, for the Houthis in Yemen, all of this represents an ongoing challenge to American interests and those of American allies that simply cannot be tolerated. And so the logic, as I understand it from speaking with people familiar with the administration's thinking, is that a swift, decisive blow against the IRGC's capabilities would actually reduce the likelihood of prolonged conflict by demonstrating that there are severe costs to continued Iranian adventurism. Whether this logic holds up when confronted with the messy reality of Middle Eastern geopolitics is, of course, another question entirely. Now let's talk about what the United Kingdom's position actually is in all of this, because this is where things become quite murky. Publicly, British officials have been extraordinarily careful in their statements. We've heard the usual diplomatic formulations about consulting with allies, about shared concerns regarding regional stability, about the need for Iran to cease its destabilizing activities. But there has been nothing, absolutely nothing, that would indicate Britain is prepared to join military action against Iran. In fact, if you read between the lines of statements from senior British military officials and foreign policy advisors, you can detect considerable unease about where this is all heading. Britain is in a very difficult position. On one hand, the special relationship with the United States remains the cornerstone of British foreign and security policy. London simply cannot afford to completely rebuff American demands, particularly on a matter that Washington clearly views as a critical national security priority. On the other hand, British participation in military strikes against Iran would have enormous consequences, domestic political consequences, international legal consequences, and practical security consequences for British personnel and interests throughout the Middle East and beyond. We must remember that Britain, unlike the United States, does not have the military capacity to operate independently at great distances from home. British military involvement in any operation against Iran would be highly dependent on American logistics, intelligence, and overall strategic command. This creates a situation where Britain would be accepting significant risks while having limited control over the overall conduct of operations. There's also the question of what Russia and China would do in response to military action against Iran. Both countries have invested heavily in their relationships with Tehran, not just economically but strategically. For Russia, Iran has been an absolutely crucial partner in Syria, providing ground forces and logistical support that were essential to keeping the Assad government in power. For China, Iran represents a critical component of its Belt and Road Initiative, a source of energy resources, and a partner in what Beijing views as a broader effort to create alternative power structures that don't revolve around American dominance. If the United States and Britain were to launch military strikes against Iran, we would almost certainly see some form of response from Moscow and Beijing. Now, I'm not suggesting we'd see Russian or Chinese military forces directly engaging American or British forces. That would risk escalation to a level that nobody wants, but we could see increased military support for Iran, acceleration of arms transfers, sharing of intelligence, and potentially even advanced air defense systems that would make future operations significantly more difficult and costly. The economic dimensions of this cannot be ignored either. Any military conflict with Iran would almost certainly disrupt oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes. Even the threat of such disruption, even the anticipation of possible conflict, is already affecting energy markets. We've seen oil prices tick upward over the past week as these reports have begun to circulate. If actual military operations were to commence, we could see oil prices spike dramatically, which would have immediate and severe consequences for the global economy, including the American economy that Trump has promised to strengthen and revitalize. It's a genuine puzzle to me how the administration squares its economic objectives with a course of action that could send energy prices soaring and potentially tip the global economy into recession. Let's return to Khamenei himself for a moment, because his personal situation is quite revealing about the broader state of affairs in Iran. Khamenei is now 85 years old. He's been supreme leader since 1989, following the death of Ayatollah Khamenei. For more than 3 decades, he has been the ultimate authority in Iran, the final decision maker on all matters of strategic importance. But he is visibly aging. His health has been a subject of speculation for years, and the question of succession, who will be the next supreme leader, looms over Iranian politics like a shadow. If Khamenei has indeed felt compelled to leave Tehran due to security concerns, this tells us something very important about how seriously the Iranian leadership is taking the current threats. This isn't a man who scares easily. This isn't a leadership that historically has shown itself willing to back down in the face of American pressure. The fact that they're apparently taking protective measures for their supreme leader suggests they have intelligence, perhaps very specific intelligence, about potential targeting. It suggests they believe the threat of American military action is real and imminent. And if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves, what does Iran do in response? Does Tehran simply wait to be struck, hoping that diplomatic interventions from Russia, China, or European powers might forestall military action? Or does Iran take preemptive measures of its own, perhaps activating proxy forces throughout the region, perhaps threatening shipping in the Gulf, perhaps taking actions that would force America's hand and determine the timing and nature of any confrontation on terms more favorable to Tehran? This is where we get into the really dangerous dynamics of escalation and miscalculation. Both sides may believe they're acting defensively. Trump may genuinely believe that striking the IRGC is necessary to prevent future attacks on American interests. Khamenei may genuinely believe that activating Iran's regional network is necessary to deter American aggression. But the interaction between these defensive measures can create an offensive reality that neither side actually wanted. We've seen this pattern before in history, where countries slide into conflicts that their leaders didn't fully intend because each step seemed reasonable as a response to the other side's actions, but the cumulative effect was war. I should also mention the domestic political context in both countries, because this matters enormously. In the United States, Trump is facing significant pressures from multiple directions. He has promised his base a more assertive foreign policy, a restoration of American strength and prestige. At the same time, he has promised to avoid new wars and to focus on domestic renewal. These are not necessarily compatible objectives, and Trump is surrounded by advisors who have very different views about which should take priority. Some of the people around Trump are extremely hawkish on Iran, viewing the Islamic Republic as an illegitimate regime that should be confronted at every opportunity. Others are more focused on the economic and political costs of military entanglement. The balance between these factions may well determine whether we actually see military action or whether this current tension resolves itself through some combination of deterrence and diplomacy. In Iran, Khamenei faces his own domestic pressures. The IRGC is not a monolithic organization. There are different factions within it, different commanders with different perspectives on how to respond to American threats. There are also significant elements within Iranian society, particularly among younger, more urban Iranians, who are deeply frustrated with the economic costs of confrontation with the West, who would prefer to see some kind of accommodation that might lead to sanctions relief and economic normalization. Khamenei has to balance these pressures while maintaining the ideological commitments that have defined the Islamic Republic since its founding. It's an enormously difficult position, made more difficult by his advanced age and the uncertainties around succession. What strikes me most about this entire situation is how little genuine communication there appears to be between Washington and Tehran. During previous crises, there were usually back channels, informal mechanisms through which the two sides could signal intentions and red lines to each other. The Swiss embassy in Tehran traditionally played this role, serving as a protecting power for American interests. But the current environment seems to lack even these basic mechanisms for crisis management. We're in a situation where both sides are reading each other's intentions primarily through public statements and military movements, which is inherently prone to misunderstanding. If I were advising either side, which of course I'm not, I would be urging the establishment of some kind of direct communication channel, even if it's informal and deniable. The risks of miscalculation right now are simply too high. We're talking about potential military conflict between the United States and a significant regional power at a time when the broader international system is already under tremendous strain from the war in Ukraine, from tensions over Taiwan, from economic uncertainties. The world is not well equipped right now to handle another major conflict, particularly one that could directly involve major powers through their relationships with Iran. As for what happens next, I genuinely don't know. I can lay out scenarios, but predicting which path we'll actually take is extraordinarily difficult. One possibility is that we're seeing a deliberate campaign of pressure designed to force concessions from Iran without actually resorting to military force. Trump may be betting that the threat of strikes, combined with reports of Khamenei's vulnerability, will push Tehran toward negotiations on terms more favorable to Washington. Another possibility is that we're genuinely on the path to military confrontation, that decisions have already been made, and that what we're seeing now is simply the preparatory phase before operations commence. A third possibility is that this entire crisis dissipates in the face of opposition from allies, concerns about economic consequences, or simply because other priorities emerge that pull attention elsewhere. What I can say with confidence is that we're in a moment of extraordinary danger and uncertainty. The combination of leadership transitions, strategic pressures, domestic political constraints, and the absence of robust communication mechanisms creates conditions where small events can have large consequences. Whether wisdom will prevail, whether cooler heads will find ways to step back from the brink, remains to be seen. But we should all be watching this situation very carefully indeed, because the decisions made in the coming days and weeks could reshape the entire Middle East and have profound consequences for global stability that extend far beyond the immediate crisis at hand.